I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and allow me to welcome you to Being and Logos, an introduction to Middle-Platonism. This seminar hopes to explore the philosophical foundations, especially in metaphysics, at the heart of Western philosophy following the death of Plato and before the rise of Plotinus in Neo-Platonism. But really importantly, this seminar is an example, an experiment really, in crowd-funded university-level education. No paywalls, no subscriptions, no fees, just here's a class for free. And that's only really possible through the generous support of my Patreon. If you want to support this project, please consider taking a look down below at the links for my Patreon. But otherwise, I'm honored to welcome you to this course as we explore the fascinating philosophical developments at the very heart, at the very origin of Christianity, of Hermeticism, of Gnosticism, and the foundations of Western Esotericism. Welcome to Being and Logos. All right, everyone. Well, we ended last lecture with Alcinous, and Alcinous sort of gave us a kind of chiding between the philosopher and the sophist, and maybe the philosopher and the rhetorician. And at the very end of the handbook, he claims that only the philosopher deals with that which is. The sophist only deals with that which appears to be, and because the philosopher deals with that which is, they're not engaging in illusions and this kind of thing, and therefore there is a philosopher that is only capable of telling the truth because they're actually talking about what really is. And we have this classic distinction made in philosophical history between us philosophers and them sophists, us philosophers and those rhetoricians. And what's interesting is that by going from the Handbook of Alcinous directly into Apuleius, we very quickly actually break that down. It sort of deconstructs itself, because in the case of Apuleius, what we have is a philosopher who's also a rhetorician. And so we kind of have a sophist who is a philosopher, though Dylan will always remind us that, in fact, Apuleius is an amateur philosopher. We can always rely on Dylan to throw a little salt in the direction of the people that he doesn't take especially seriously. And Apuleius is, in some sense, one of those guys. So, on the one hand, is he a rhetorician? Yes. Is he a bit of an amateur philosopher? Yes. Is the philosophy that we get from Apuleius especially interesting? Not really. But what he does give us, again, is another facet of the jewel that is Middle Platonism. And by getting into him today, we'll, I think, reveal some things that are very interesting about him, especially, I would say, as it comes to his interaction with Western Esotericism, which I can say of three distinct ways in which Apuleius is very important for the history of Western Esotericism. One, of course, he wrote maybe the most important work on demonology in the classical world, the text that is called On Socrates as God, De Deo Socrates. Although it's unlikely that he actually gave it that title, it seems like it'd be better titled something like De Daemone Socrates or Platonis. But it is a book exclusively dealing with the question of what the daemones are, and really sets the stage following the Epinomis and some of the work of Plutarch in terms of setting up pagan demonology, which of course will greatly inform Christian demonology. And so that's very important on that side of things. Also, the Golden Ass, or the Metamorphosis, is another important glimpse into sort of late classical attitudes toward magic and the mysteries, by the way. So there are elements of that in the Metamorphosis that are very important. So that's incredibly important. But also, you'll remember that traditionally it is Apuleius who is actually described as the author of the Hermetic Asclepius. And in fact, when you see editions, Renaissance editions of Apuleius's work, almost always included in there will be a copy of the Hermetic Asclepius. And there is an idea that, you know, being adjunct to magic and adjunct to the mysteries, and therefore the Asclepius is somehow associated with Apuleius as well. So an incredibly important figure in the history of Western Esotericism, and a not minor figure when it comes to the history of Platonism. And as I mentioned, right, his major work, the Metamorphosis, is the only Roman novel that survives down to this day intact. We have fragments of other novels that do survive, but the Metamorphosis is our only completely intact Roman novel that survives, which is a great pity because it is a fantastic little novel if you ever have the chance to read it. full of lovely digressions, which are published on their own. The digression on Cupid and Psyche is a classic, well appreciated, and again, you can sort of extract it and do just it. We do also have a collection of philosophical works that survive, the most important of which are his, like I said, on the De Socrates, and some other works. He has also a summary of the dogmas of Plato that we'll be getting into. So both philosophical works and literary works and rhetorical works all survive through Apuleius. Now, what's interesting is that if you go out and buy the stack of 3 volumes of Apuleius here in the Loeb Classical Library, some of his philosophical works will not be included. For instance, On the Doctrine of Plato is not included in these, largely because those are regarded as spurious. They're not regarded as works that are certainly by Apuleius. However, Dillon accepts all of the works attributed to him, even including the translation of the pseudo-Aristotle's De Mundo on the world. He attributes all of them to Apuleius, and when he builds out his vision of Apuleius's Platonism, he accepts them without much reservation. So what is interesting, again, is that here in the Loeb, you won't find Apuleius's work on Plato, unfortunately, his textbook on Plato, but Dillon does take it to be authentic. Now, to be clear, the Platonism that we find in Apuleius is not terribly impressive, given the kind of Platonism that we've seen coming so far. It's not terribly inventive. It's not terribly exotic in any way, but it is in many ways typical of the kind of Platonism that we'd associate with the Middle Platonic period. And so in this ways, it's interesting, but not terribly interesting, although we'll see a couple of the more interesting aspects of Apuleius's take on Platonism. And of course, also, right, he has a lot to say about magic, and so we'll be talking a bit about his theory of the daemones, which is very Xenocratian. We've seen already in Xenocrates sort of a precursor, and Plutarch a bit of a precursor to him. And so we have this intersection of Apuleius with esotericism and with magic and with Platonism, and these elements were very interesting to people back in antiquity. And when, of course, esotericism reemerges in the Renaissance through the translations of people like Marsilio Ficino and the Hermetica, Apuleius was sort of one of the stars of the show when it came to that material. Though I don't know that he's read as widely as he was during the Renaissance. There were many editions beginning in the 1460s, dozens of editions that came out during the Renaissance. People really loved Apuleius, both the content of what he wrote and also his style. He's a really nice Latinist. If you like to read Latin and you don't want to read someone like Cicero, Apuleius's Latin is very floral, but not too difficult to read, although he does do a bit of neologism, so sometimes hunting down his words can be a bit of a challenge if you don't have a pretty good lexicon, although there is a really good lexicon online that does have a lot of his more strange neologisms. He's born in around 125 in North Africa. This is actually the remains. You can see here on the screen, you can see the remains of the city that he was born in. So he was born in North Africa, and another compatriot a couple centuries later, St. Augustine, also of North African origin, will have a deep hatred of Apuleius, and they sort of go back and forth as interlocutors in a certain kind of way. But he comes from a relatively wealthy family. It seems like his family was part of some of the original settlers who moved to North Africa from Italy, and he comes from a relatively affluent family and got basically the best education that you could get in Carthage. And when he exhausted that education, which was very broad, by the way, he was traveled then to Athens in around 150, and it is in Athens that he becomes more trained in philosophy specifically, although he gets a very wide education, and he likes to show it off too. If you read in his text, especially in the Metamorphoses, he will often just like name drop people and talk about faraway places and specific kinds of fish and things like that. So he really likes to show off how well educated he is. And so he really did know his stuff quite well. We also know that he had a scientific interest, and he apparently wrote some scientific books. He had a specific interest in fish, and following in the tradition of Aristotle. Often Aristotle's books on biology don't get read that much anymore, but Aristotle, as you'll know, on the Isle of Lesbos, was pretty interested in classifying all kinds of animals, and it seems like that project continued through Theophrastus, and that sort of went into the medical world, and eventually that would influence people like Galen. It seems like Apuleius also had a kind of scientific interest, specifically in fish, and apparently his investigations into fish led to him being accused of sorcery, of being a goes. And so we're going to see this element of Apuleius kind of haunting him throughout his entire career. He's consistently accused of being a goes, of being a kind of sorcerer. So this is going to follow him around. We'll get to this more in a minute. And it probably is the case because he was probably pretty learned on topics of magic, as we can see from the Metamorphoses. He knows a lot about learned and folk magic, and it shows that off in the Metamorphoses. But also he was himself initiated into a lot of different mysteries, specifically the mystery of Isis. He was an adherent to the mystery of Isis. I think he was also in the book, if you read the Metamorphoses, the main character of that book, which is very much not modeled on Apuleius himself. He gets initiated, I think, into the mysteries of Osiris. And so this was a thing that interested Apuleius. He was the high priest in his own hometown, I think, following his father, for whom I think there was a statue erected, and there are inscriptions left in the region that do name him. And so he was a high priest, and so the mysteries were very important to Apuleius. So he is definitely not an amateur when it comes to religious questions. And in the same way that we've seen for Plutarch and other people, the intersection of magic and religion were important for Apuleius, as well as people like Plutarch, again, who was a high priest of Apollo there at Delphi. Now, what really got Apuleius in a great deal of trouble is he was traveling back over North Africa, heading over to Alexandria, apparently, and he stopped over in a city, Oea, and I think what is now modern-day Libya, and he's meeting a colleague there, and the colleague that he met there, his mother was a recent widow, and well, Apuleius thought, hey, she seems pretty cool. I think that Dylan refers to her as still lusty, which is just great. I don't know. But apparently she was still in the game, and Apuleius and her married, which is an interesting thing to do when you come and hang out with your friend and you marry her mom or his mom. At any rate, when that friend died, the members of his family or her family accused Apuleius of using witchcraft or sorcery, goetia, to seduce this widow, who was also apparently pretty wealthy. Apuleius was wealthy himself, and he was accused of seducing her using love magic. And what's impressive, what's really great, is that we have his defense, his apology. And his apology is fantastic because it gives us a glimpse into how magic was perceived at that time, right? Because what Apuleius wants to show is, yeah, I know a lot about magic, and maybe I could have if I wanted to, but I didn't. And here's all the different forms of magic, and here's why I didn't do it. And so, she fell in love with me on good terms. And at any rate, the apology is one of our best learned glimpses into magical practice in the sort of early part of this period, and it is a great compliment if you're a fan of the Greek magical papyri. In many ways, the complementary text to the Greek magical papyri, many of which were written around this time period, is Apuleius's apology and his defense of himself as not having used magic to seduce his friend's mom. So Apuleius is up to whatever. But at any rate, he does marry her. They do eventually marry. He does successfully defend himself against the charges of having used magic to defend himself, and eventually he's still run out of town. When you can win in court, and then the jilted members of the family who was hoping to get some of this inheritance do not get it, and so Apuleius was a marked man, and he left town. And then he vanishes. We don't know much about what happens to him after he leaves this region, and we don't know a lot about what happens. And after about 170, he sort of leaves the historical record. So almost everything we know about him is just a couple of inscriptions, and then what we learn about him through his surviving texts. So at any rate, it must have been fun to be hanging out with Apuleius, going around looking at fish, seducing widows, being accused of magic. It must have been fun days with Apuleius. So But we get into his philosophical works, right? His main philosophical works, as I mentioned, are the text de Platone dogmate eus on Plato and his dogma, or his, I think it better not dogma, doctrine. The De Deo Socrates on the daemon of Socrates. Many people, Augustine, by the way, says that De Deo Socrates and the golden ass were names that Apuleius gave to his works. Most people do not think Augustine, that's correct. Most people think Augustine is calling them that. Because again, when he calls it on Socrates as God, he's like kind of shading Apuleius to some degree. Really, what the book is really about is the question of what are the daemones, and the text on Plato and his doctrine is, again, this is these texts are, and the golden ass is not a really great name for the text. It's better. All the manuscripts call it the Metamorphosis. And so it's probably that's the title that Apuleius gave it. But also we know that he translated a section of pseudo-Aristotle's book De Mundo, and we also have a Peri Hermeneus, which is his book on rhetoric, which actually preserves some degree of Apuleius's work on logic and his understanding of logic. But how does Apuleius set up himself? He refers to himself as a philosophicus Platonicus, as a philosopher, a Platonic philosopher. So he is using the language of calling himself a Platonist. But who does he say that Plato followed? Plato, of course, is given over to being a Pythagorean. So already in Apuleius, we have the tradition still that Plato himself was a Pythagorean. But notice what's missing, right, folks? One of the things that's gone missing in both Alcinous and in Apuleius is the doctrines of the Agrapha Dogmata, which we take to have been originally Pythagorean doctrines, specifically of the one and the indefinite monad. They're not here. They're not in Alcinous, and they're not in Apuleius. So it's interesting that while both Alcinous and Apuleius associate themselves as Platonists, and certainly Apuleius is describing Plato as a Pythagorean, conspicuously what's now gone missing from Platonism are precisely these early Pythagorean doctrines. So it's just conspicuous that they're not there, right? So especially here when we have Plato being described as a Pythagorean, the doctrine of the one and the indefinite monad or indefinite dyad is not to be found here. But we now can begin working through Apuleius's description of what he takes to be the Platonic philosophy. He divides the universe into three, kind of four, but at least technically divides it into three. So this is the divine, this is God. The next thing down are the forms, of course. We're going to be good Platonists, so we're going to have the forms. And lastly, we have matter. Now, he says that there are just three dimensions of reality, but of course, he needs to fit the demiurge in somewhere. And he will talk as if nous and the demiurge are the same thing, classic Middle-Platonism. But the question is, where is the demiurge in all of this? And it's a bit confusing because sometimes he'll describe God as utterly transcendent. Classic sort of hyper-ontological status of God as we've seen in other Platonists. And then sometimes he's going to put God down in the muck, basically being the demiurge. So Apuleius is just not consistent about this. He's simply not consistent about where exactly God is. Sometimes God is above being, sometimes God is in being, a being among beings, although a demiurge being. So it's not really clear where this is. He will sometimes describe God as heavenly, which is to say sort of in the heavens, right? This is classic, more sort of Attic style language for describing the gods. And sometimes God is unspeakable. So again, Apuleius cannot make his mind up about whether the deity is transcendent or immanent in a way that clearly the deity is transcendent in something like Alcinous, whereas here this is not. Now, one of the things you'll notice if you've been reading along in Dylan, and one of the things we can keep track of as we're working through Apuleius today is comparing Apuleius's position to those of Alcinous, because allegedly Alcinous and Apuleius have both learned Platonism from Gaius, that they represent the school of Gaius. And one of the things that Dylan does is basically argue that there is enough light between Alcinous and Apuleius that we can no longer hold that they at least held a doctrine of Platonism from the same teacher. That there's enough difference that whatever Gaius taught either one of them, neither one of them or have enough overlap to be said to be part of a school. So in many ways, what Dillon did in the 1970s was deconstruct the idea that there was a distinct school of Gaius, of which Apuleius, Alcuinus, and Galen actually were all members and therefore represent the same doctrine. They simply don't, right? We can even see that now with already with Apuleius's conception a bit muddied of God. Of course, the forms for Apuleius are the classic ideas. They are simple, they are eternal, and they are the divine thoughts. By now, this has just become Platonic orthodoxy. That the idea that the forms are thoughts in the mind of God has now become rote. It's a thing that you say in passing. You don't have to argue for it. In a way that you think about someone like Eudorus of Alexandria, he's having to argue something like that. Whereas here, this is just accepted as Platonic orthodoxy. So clearly here, since Philo especially, although we can't tell what relationship Philo may have had in terms of his Platonism to the Platonism of someone like Apuleius, but already by Philo we have the forms as thoughts in the mind of God, and here in Apuleius it is simply taken for granted. Of substance, and again the language that he uses is materia, but probably it's translating ousia. So we still have this this Aristotelian language. We did see that in Alcuinus. You'll remember Alcuinus likes to use the word ousia, which is Platonic language. Plato was Aristotelian language. Plato himself almost always talked about physis or hule, matter or nature, whereas Aristotle will talk about ousia, and the ousia language is probably the language being used here by behind the Latin in Apuleius as well. But of it, there are two types, of course. There is the intelligible and there is the sensible. That is to say, there's the formal nature of reality, which is purely intelligible. This is the forms. And there is a sensible dimension of reality, which is matter, which has been informed. So matter is sensible, intelligible as such, because it has been informed in the classic the use of the demiurge and the mold and all of that. He describes matter as being a non-corporeal, a purely potential substrate. That's not Plato. That's Aristotle, right? That's the way Aristotle talks. Aristotle talks about matter ousia as a kind of unformed substrate. And eventually that'll ultimately lead into, it will lead into the materia prima talk of the Middle Ages. But again, at the base here, we see matter while understood in an Aristotelian sense, is still being echoed as fundamentally Platonic in nature. And so matter is kind of the mold of what comes to be. And again, I don't have to remind folks that when Aristotle conceived of matter, we shouldn't think of it the way we think of it. But again, we should conceive of ousia as a kind of substrate which acquires accidents. But it is always with an accident. That is to say, never does ousia appear ipso facto. You never see like raw matter somewhere. It just doesn't occur like that in nature. It is a theoretical construct. And we see it here as the passive potential substrate of the cosmos, which is again classic Aristotelian ideas. The most primitive way that matter is organized is into the stoicheia, into the elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And by the way, that the pun doesn't work in Latin the way that it works in Greek, but in Greek there's always a pun of the stoicheia, of the elements, and it's punning on the word for letters in Greek, the word for the letters of the alphabet. And so they're imagining the elements as being the alphabet of nature. Earth, air, and fire, water are the alphabet by which you construct the cosmos. So this is an idea that Apuleius takes in, although again the pun doesn't really work in Latin the way that it works in Greek. And despite the fact that he's relying on a form of a theory of matter based on Aristotelianism, he does reject Plato's or Aristotle's idea of the ether. So he rejects the idea that above the moon there is a distinct substance known as the ether, of which the planets and those kind of elements are made of. So he rejects it. Although he will sometimes talk about the fire in between the earth and the moon as a purified fire. And that language is Stoic language, right? The idea of there is a hyper pure fire of which the daemones, which we'll get to in just a minute, which they are composed of, in that hyper purified fire, that's stoicizing language, which again, none of us are surprised at this point where we see these Platonic philosophers stoicizing or adopting Aristotelian language or what have you. Of the vexed question of how the cosmos came to be, and again, you're already seeing it, and maybe this will be the last time we see it. There's always the vexed question of what does it mean for the universe to be genetos? What does it mean for it to have been created? And we've already seen in Taurus the sort of the fourfold possibilities of what this means. For Apuleius, he accepts, I think it was options 3 and 4, of which the first is that because the universe is composed of earth, air, fire, and water, and those are created, you can create fire, I suppose you can create water, create earth. Because those are created things, we say the universe is created. But we're saying it only in the sense that because it is composed of those things, we can say that it is created, but not created in the sense of it was created in time. So it shares in the fact that these elements are created, but that does not mean itself was created. And of course, he accepts the standard orthodox position of Platonism that the universe is an always coming to be, that the genetos of the universe is a coming to be-ness, not a having been created in time. Now, I know that this is kind of getting, it's like I'm really beating a dead horse when it comes to these questions, but let me just put a pin in this, and so that you know, these questions are going to matter enormously as they're taken up into Christianity. One of the biggest questions that the early Christians are going to be dealing with up till the period of John Plotinus is the universe eternal? That's the classic position taken up by Plato and Aristotle, at least this interpretation of Plato, that the universe, they're eternalists. And that's not going to jive with scripture as it's absorbed into Christianity. And there's going to be a huge break beginning in the 1st and 2nd centuries where they're going to be arguing that the universe is made out of nothing. And we're going to see the emergence of creation from nothing that is going to be a big banner aspect of Christianity. And that argument that the universe is made from nothing, which will be really driven home by philosophers like John Plotinus, this is going to matter enormously in the history of Christianity. So I know that I sound like I'm repeating this question a lot, but it becomes such a big deal in the development of Christianity, as opposed to this question of the eternal nature of reality, which is associated deeply with paganism. That is a deeply pagan idea that Christianity is going to set itself off from philosophically, and it's going to be one of the most decisive places where Christian theology is going to really break decisively with pagan philosophy, and it's going to be one of the hallmarks in many ways of Christian philosophy that is shared universally among Christians, that the universe is created out of nothing, and that is going to be a big part of the development of Christian intellectual culture as a defense of the doctrine of creation from nothing. So we should, again, put a pin in it. It's worth noticing. We may come back to it when we get to early Christian Middle-Platonism. But he argues, right, that the universe subsists as an eternal creation of the divine. So it is an eternal creation of God, and that our tripartite soul, again, the classic Orthodox position on the tripartite soul, is an expression of the divine soul, which we'll see in just a bit. But again, exactly where mens, which is his translation of nous, where this primal intellect is in his ontology is not clear. Because as I said, sometimes God is above being, and sometimes God is identified as the demiurge. So it's not really clear where this deity is in his ontology, but he can play a bit fast and loose with it. He is a rhetorician after all. I'm going to keep throwing shade at the rhetoricians and the sophists because I'm contractually obliged in my philosophy department degree to do that. Just like I have to throw shade at the Epicureans, whether I like them or not. It's just a thing I have to do. Of his books, the De Deo Socrates, his book on the daemones, is one of our best handbooks on this topic from history, aside from Plutarch. This is the book on demonology. So if you really want to get into pagan demonology, this is the book. This is the book for you. I'm probably going to do a whole episode on it on Esoterica at some point, but it is just such an interesting text. And it worried people like Augustine, because Augustine really did not like the idea of the daemones, and he really wanted to, again, conform Christian theology to its system of angels and demons. And part of what had to be done was to show that the pagan belief in the daemones had to be destroyed. And so Augustine really takes Apuleius to task because a pagan demonology is incongruent with Christian demonology and angelology. And so Augustine really takes Apuleius to task, which means, to me at least, that Apuleius's work, by the time we get Augustine there in the 5th century, is that Apuleius's work on demonology was popular because Augustine felt the need to deal with it. So I suspect that while his take on Middle Platonism or Platonism may not be all that interesting, his take on demonology probably was widely accepted. And I think this is the reason why Augustine has to take it to task. But why are they demones? Why are they demones? Well, they're demones but for Apuleius because nature abhors gaps. Nature does not like there to be gaps. And specifically, and we've already seen this in Alcinous, nature doesn't like there to be gaps in intelligence. The universe needs to be filled at some level with intelligence because intelligence is the divine. And so if there is a region, a gap where where intelligence is, that's kind of a gap where God is. And there's a sense in which that can't happen. The nature needs to be filled with intelligence, and where we have intelligence is in the region, again, beneath the moon and above the earth, and that region needs to be filled with some kind of intelligent beings. And so this is the reason why the gods gods sort of fill that region with the daemones. And of the daemones, Apuleius gives a fantastic little definition which will delight anybody who is a fan of Aristotle, but also if you have an itch, and the only thing that can scratch it is a little analytic philosophy. Apuleius gives us a fantastic definition of daemones, of which they are the genus animate, right? They are animus, they are spirits, so they're not us, but they're of the genus animus, they're spirits. They are of mind rational, so they have rational minds. They're of spirit passionate, right? So remember, this is a thing going all the way back to Xenocrates. Remember that the spirits, the daemones, have passions like we do, but they are eternal in a way that we are not. They're of body airy, so they are of an airy substance. Notice he does not say they're of a fiery substance, but he says here that they are of an airy substance, and they are of duration eternal. They are of duration eternal. So they are the daemones are spirits, rational spirits. They suffer from the pathoi just like we do, and they are of body airy, and they live forever. So we have a position in a bit more analytic language typical of Xenocrates that we've already seen way back in Xenocrates, but also expressed in Plutarch as well. And of these daemones, because they suffer from passions, they crave things. They like things. They like to have certain kinds of things. And unsurprisingly, one of the things they like are the kind of things we like. They like food. They like drink. They like the smell of things. And this is the reason why, according to Apuleius, why the various daemones like sacrifices. They like the smell, just like you would like the smell, for instance, of a barbecue, right? You reach out your window and smell a barbecue and be drawn to the barbecue and go over, right? The daemones are also, they like these kinds of things. And so what do they instruct humans to do? Well, they instruct humans to burn the entrails of animals because they like that smell. And the daemones, because you've sacrificed something to them, it's do ut des, right? You give them something, they give you something. So a daemon might be really good at telling the future or revealing, some buried treasure or whatever. You can do sacrifices to give them something, they give you something in return. This is the origin of religion for Apuleius. Apuleius thinks that religion, interacting with these daemones through ritual observances, right, is where we get religion. And some of the daemones are kind of gloomy. I love the phrase that he uses, that they require gloomy sacrifices. So some of them are kind of malevolent. Some of them are beneficent, but they are all desirous of things. It's like you're desirous of things. They have the pathoi, and therefore we interact with them in a kind of do ut des mechanism, right, by which we give them something to satisfy their pathoi, and they give us stuff in return to help us out. So this is in some sense where the daemones come from, and this is kind of why we have religion in some ways, is to interact with the daemones in a proper kind of way. Of the daemones, there are three types. You have one. There's one inside you right now. If you believe Apuleius, your soul is a daimon. Your soul is a daimon. Now, that daimon has its own personality, of which you are an expression of it, but sometimes it's not exactly a good fit, and this can lead to things like mental illness. You can also talk to your daimon. All right, so this is a place where Socrates was able to talk to his daimon. His daimon, his mind and the mind of the daimon were able to be interlocutors. And not only that, if you're especially wise, which we'll get to the sage in just a little bit, you can really communicate with the daimones and learn all kinds of things because they're not really bound by time the same way we are. And so you can learn, like, for instance, what future things are about to happen. So if you get to be good with your daimon and other daimones, you can learn things like the future. And this is the reason why divination and stuff works. There are, of course, other daimones. When you die, if you've lived a good life, you can go on to be a blessed daimon. If you've lived a bad life, you may become an evil daimon. And these become the lames and the larvae of Roman religion. And again, we're in Latin land now. And so as you'll know, in Latin and Roman mythology, Roman religion, there are righteous dead, the lames. And of these, right, there's some pictured here, the lames here. You would have a shrine to them in your home. They may be ancestral spirits. You would offer things to them. You could talk to them. And so the lames are the good ancestor spirits. The larvae are the bad ancestor spirits. And this explains why they become good and evil. This becomes the kind of life that you have. Because again, if you live a profligate life and you die, you will become a profligate daimon. And you'll go around banging pots and pans or doing whatever things that evil poltergeists do. In addition to the daimons in us and the daimons who have passed on, there are also daimones who never become embodied. And these are non-embodied daimones, and they live up there again between here and the moon, and you can interact with them in all kinds of ways. You can interact with them in all kinds of ways. So again, this is kind of where religion, in some sense, gets its origin, is in the interaction with these daimones, or these gods, the lames, the lares, and the various species of the kind of entities that existed at this time. Again, this is an interesting place where we see a bit of Roman religion. We've been in such Greek territory for so long that we see some Roman religion kind of poking through. And it's interesting that Apuleius is applying Platonism to the specific concerns of Roman religion, as opposed to Greek religion, which we often conflate. But the Romans and the Greeks, they are distinct elements of both religious systems, of which, of course, they're much more complex than just one system. We get to the question of fate. And again, I know that this is probably getting a little boring to some of you guys because we keep talking about the same topics over and over again. And if fate is one of those topics and you're like, why are they constantly talking about fate? It's because fate was an incredibly important concept to the ancient pagan philosophers. And the reason why it doesn't seem to concern to us is because since the rise of Christianity, fate has gone the way of the dodo. There's no talk hardly anymore of fate in the Western world because Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have largely dispensed with the concept, and it is no longer philosophically or religiously live anymore. So we don't talk about fate or weird anymore. Those are concepts we typically associate with paganism, but they were hugely important during this time period. Now, everybody at this time, Platonic people, the Platonists, they have to deal with Stoicism, because Stoicism, beginning with Chrysippus, has made, in my opinion, a devastatingly powerful argument for determinism. And as you know, both Platonism and eventually Christianity, by the way, they're not going to truck much with determinism, with the exception of my dear Calvinists in the room. But in general, determinism and Christianity, again, volunteerism is going to be one of the banner elements of Christian philosophy. And Platonism shares that concern. Why? Because Platonism sees itself as a mode by which you undergo ascesis, and you undergo discipline, paideia, and you become a better person. But again, philosophy is a way of life, according to Platonism. And if you're simply fated to something, there's no sense in trying to do anything. So Platonism is deeply concerned about the question of fate because they want to preserve free will, because they are committed to the idea that you can improve yourself via philosophy. Now, What they end up doing typically, and we've seen this already, and Apuleius is going to double down on this, is they introduce all kinds of ways of separating fate and providence and free will, right? They want to separate all of those out, and they want to leave at least some room for free will. And we can see whether this works or not, but it's quite an ingenious way of doing this. So Apuleius defines fate in three different ways. The first of the ways he defines it is as a divine logos, untransgressible because of inescapable causality. So that's fate in the strong sense of the word. And if that sounds stoic to you, then good. Your stoic ears are working. So that sounds very stoic-y, and that's certainly the kind of fate that he does not want to deal with, because if that's the case, right, then we are bound to it and there's nothing we can do. Again, remember that for the Platonist, you are trying to act according to the divine. You're trying to undergo theosis at some level. For the Stoics, you're trying to act according to nature. Acting according to nature means accepting your fate. Whereas for Plato and his followers, it means becoming godlike, means improving yourself morally and spiritually. The next is that it is a nomos, or it is a lex, it is a law by which the universe operates. This is going to be closer to where Apuleius wants to land. This is going to be closer to where Apuleius wants to land. That he's going to have what is called the legislative theory of fate, or the hypothetical theory of fate. The hypothetical theory of fate, or the legislative theory of fate, is the world works through certain laws, and if you violate those laws, certain things happen, and if you act in accordance to those laws, other things will happen. So an example of fate would be that there is, for instance, the law of gravity. And because there is a law of gravity and I jump out of a second floor window, I'm going to have to deal with the consequences of that. The moment I jump out the window, I am fated to deal with the consequences of me having poorly interacted with the law of gravity. So if you commit a moral outrage, right? If you commit a moral outrage and there's no court of justice to punish you, then the gods might send the gods might send demonic punishers to go get you and punish you. That's one of the things the demonics do, according to Apuleius and many others. So the idea here, right, is that the law of reality has certain kinds of outcomes. This is the hypothetical theory of fate. The last version of fate that Apuleius deals with is the idea that the universe operates according to a divine law in which the past, the present, and the future are all united. And this is a sort of a problem that we're going to see develop again later in people like Augustine, is that if we have a God who is all-knowing, then God knows the truth value of all propositions about the future. God needs to know about the future in order to be God. And if God knows all the truth values about the future, where does that leave us any free will? Now, Augustine's solution to this is just going to say, well, God knows them, but God's not causing it. Me knowing that your heart is beating is not causing your heart to beat. I can know things without causing them. And so God's knowledge of future events doesn't cause them, and therefore you still have God's omniscience preserved, whereas you still also have free will preserved. It seems like Apuleius wants to make a similar kind of move. It seems like he wants to make a similar kind of move. Of fate, he separates between the activity of fate and the substance of fate. The activity of fate is the sealing of it. It's the doing. It's the ongoing event of things being fated. That should be relatively straightforward. The substance of fate is actually a bit more interesting. And of the substance of fate, he thinks that there are three substances of fate. The first substance of fate are the fixed stars. The next layer of fate is the planets, right? The specific planets. And the last substance of fate is what he calls the portion around the earth. Now, what exactly the portion around the earth specifically means isn't clear, but what he has in mind here is that God transmits fate from outside of the realm of the universe, outside of the realm of the cosmos, beyond the fixed stars, down through the planets, and then down to us. And so the chain of causation, the chains of fated causation, are astral. They're astral in character. And of course, this should not be surprising because we are now living in the heyday of Hellenistic astrology. And so this is the chain, the causal structure by which fate is emanated down from the divine realm to our realm, both in the form of natural laws, but also in the individual fates of people. Now, people, human beings, because human beings are daemones, they have a unique ability about them. Natural law affects the body, right? So if I jump out the window, right, I'll plummet and break my legs, God forbid, right? Because fate directly affects natural bodies. But the thing that makes me jump out the window, my logisticon, which in that case would not be performing very well, but my soul, because it is daemonic, is not bound by fate in quite the same way. So while I can freely choose to do things, I cannot freely get out of the consequences of having done them. So he leaves a degree of volunteerism in place, whereas I can choose, but once I've made the choice, well, now everything's fated around it. Now, this is something similar to what we saw in Alcunus. It's actually a very similar theory of fate in Alcunus. Now, the problem, of course, is it seems to always assume, right, that at any given moment you're free to choose, as if there's no causal chain behind you. And for the Stoics, Chrysippus and his gang, they're just going to be asking the very basic question of, well, what caused you to make that decision? And what caused you to make that decision? And what caused you to make that decision? And if you look at that chain, the decisions have always been made, and therefore they're fated too. So this is not, again, does it break the Chrysippan argument? I don't know that it does, but this is the idea that it seems to engage here. Now, in addition to this, right, he also wants to have providence. This is the thing coming from the Stoics. The Stoics really love the concept of pronoia. And in fact, they see the determinism of reality as being the result of pronoia. And the idea is, if there is pronoia, everything is fated, because God providentially orders reality to be good. And if it were ordered in any other way, then it would be ordered badly. And therefore, because God has ordered it all, and God is all powerful, God has ordered it correctly. And therefore, pronoia is determinative of all decisions, because they are the best possible decisions. Kind of a Stoic flavor of Leibniz. The way that, and the Platonists want to hold on to this. They like the idea of pronoia as well. Why? Because they like the idea that God has this relationship to reality of oikiosis, right? That the cosmos is oikeon to the divine. God loves the cosmos. God has done the best via God's demiurgic activity to make the best possible world. And the fact that the world is intelligible and the world is good for the Platonists is evidence of God's pronoia. But they don't want to go all the way with the Stoics and say that it is fated. They don't want to go that far. And so what he does is he kind of says, look, of these three layers of fate, pronoia is operating at each level. So primary providence is said to enclose fate. So fate is kind of the mechanism by which things happen, but it is always guided by pronoia. So fate is what happens, guided by pronoia. At the second level of providence, we have the astro objects, right? The sort of classical, the planets. They are also being enclosed by pronoia. So this is a place where God fates the world, but the stars are at some level, the planets are doing God's bidding. And you'll remember this is a great example. The Stoics argued that, or rather Plutarch argued that God can even upset the natural order in order to better us. And remember, the moon is an example of this. The moon should be, because it's made of earth, it should be, it should fall into the earth, but it doesn't. It's set up there, and God puts it there in order to move the tides around in order to benefit us somehow, right? So again, this is a place where God's pronoia is said to act on the very instruments of fate in order to operate in our own beneficence. And lastly, right, we have the idea that fate encloses our free will via the planetary gods. Now, how exactly it encloses them is not clear, and where free will fits into all this is not clear, but this is the way that he tries to sort this out. And lastly, the tertiary form of providence, because everything's going to happen in threes, right? We love Xenocrates and everything happening in threes. Tertiary providence is going to be the direct agency of the daemones down here on earth. So like I said, if you do something like kill someone and no one ever catches you, then the gods might send the Furies, for instance, to come and punish you. Well, because you killed that person unjustly, there's a natural outcome, right? This is like Platonic karma almost. There's a natural celestial outcome, or a natural outcome of this, where justice must be done. The universe is a just place. Justice must be done. And so what might happen is, because you did that, you did X, well, now God is going to send the daemones in the form of the Furies to come down and punish you. So in this way, the gods, the daemones, become a kind of organ. They become an expression of divine will as, again, fate, but again, in this hypothetical sense. You did X, therefore Y happens. So where free will fits into all this is not really clear to me. And I don't know that making lots of distinctions, you can like smuggle free will in there. But I feel like it's sort of the tendency among the Platonists is if you just make enough distinctions, well, free will is in there somewhere, right? And I think that's kind of what Apuleius does, and Alcuinus too, is he's trying to say, look, there is some degree of fate, there is some degree of pronoia, some degree of providence, and yet underneath all of that, there's still the littlest amount of free will via this business of the hypothetical theory of free will. I don't think the Stoics would have bought this at all. I think the Stoics would be like, no, dude, you're kicking the can down the road. Again, the chain of causation goes back forever, and it's always been fated. And you can't have your cake and eat it too, guys. Either you're gonna have pronoia or not. And if you're not gonna have pronoia, then you have a world driven by chance, and God forbid that leads directly to Epicureanism, where it's just atoms and void, guys, and we don't want to go that direction. So it's either pronoia or the road for the Stoics, and again, the Platonists are going to try to cut it in the middle. And also, again, the inheritance of this is the exact kind of speculation is going to be the kind of speculation, right, that's going to deeply inform Christianity. We have the tripartite soul. That should be completely unsurprising. These guys are Platonists after all. We have the tripartite soul. And like Alcuinus and Plutarch, he's going to associate the soul, the senses, the irrational soul, with the elements. So sight is associated with fire, hearing with air, taste with water, touch with earth, and smell with smoke or vapor. So again, the senses, God has engineered the universe, right, such that we perceive everything there is, right, with the exception of the daemones, I guess, which are kind of airy in a way, but our senses are tied to the structure of reality. There is a reason why the reality is made of certain kinds of things, and we are made in the same way, and therefore our senses interact with those things in a way that is providential, right? The fact that that your light, you can see fire and see anything is providential, because God has engineered us in such a way that our sense organs are directly associated with the stoicheia. You also notice that if you get to reading Apuleius, he'll go on various kinds of medical digressions. For instance, he's really interested in what the liver does. The liver is of big interest to both Galen and to Apuleius. Of course, there's a divinatory element about livers as well. They're curious about why it is that the liver is the chosen organ by which the daemones impress themselves onto, so that it can be read. But also the role of the liver in the human body is of great interest to them. And so there's a lot of digressions in Apuleius along medical lines. And that, of course, is attached also to Galen, who's also the big physician at this time as well. Again, unsurprisingly, in ethics, we have the idea that there are two types of goods. There are the divine goods, which are the virtues, and then there are the human goods, which are the external goods. And unsurprisingly, he rejects the idea that that eudaimonia is only to be had of the virtues. So this is not stoicizing in that regard. He's going to go against Chrysippus and argue that we need both the divine goods and the external goods in order to truly achieve eudaimonia. And the reason why the external goods are good at all is that they participate in the eternal goods. So this is a way of saving the external goods. Food tastes good because it participates in the goodness of the divine goods. So you're able to say eudaimonia is only possible with both goods, and that in many ways you rescue the human goods by associating them, making them ontologically dependent on the divine goods. And of course, right, we have reason, and God is reason. God is a thinking being. God is nous, or mens in Latin, and we use our reason to attain to godlikeness in a very typical way of Platonism. Although what's interesting, though, is that he does not stoicize in the direction of the external goods, but he does stoicize in the direction of the question of why the divine goods exist at all. And the reason why the divine goods exist is because God has an interest in getting to know us. God is oikeon to the human being. We are we are a region of the divine in the sense that we are a daimon. And because we are a daimon, we are thinking entities. And in that way, we are godlike. And therefore, God has transmitted that nature to us in God's providential love, grace. And this is done because God has a relationship of oikeiosis to us. So this is interesting, again, because in Apuleius, oikeiosis is why God does good things at all. But you'll remember that in Alcuinus, oikeiosis is explicitly rejected as to why we attain to the good. We attain to the good because we are in service of God for Alcuinus, but here, right, because it is the divine nature, right? Virtue is the divine nature in Alcuinus in a way that for Apuleius, it is actually transmitted through oikeiosis. So again, to Dylan's point, is it the case that is this a case that Gaius taught oikeiosis? Well, it seems like for Apuleius, he accepts it, whereas for Alcuinus, he rejected it. Human beings are born with both the seeds of good and ill. So this sounds a little bit like the rabbinical idea of the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov, that we have a good inclination and a bad inclination. The seeds of those are born into us. That language of seeds, spermatikoi in Greek, is more typical for Stoics. And the way that we negotiate virtue is we negotiate it through reason. We are able to, unlike, for instance, animals, we are able to better ourselves because we can tend toward our reason, and therefore we can drive our soul in the direction of the virtues. And of those virtues, of that reasonableness, there are two forms. Sophia, which is sort of a technical or theoretical form of wisdom, and there is phronesis. Again, who does this sound like? Not Plato. It sounds like Aristotle. Aristotle, right? Phronesis, the phonetic path to the virtues is Aristotelian, right? That is to say, it's practical reason. You can't think yourself to being a good person. You have to go out and do it. You can't think yourself to be courageous. You have to go do stuff, and you learn to be courageous through doing it. And that wisdom is technical wisdom. You get it through doing things. But again, what does Apuleius want to do? He wants to have it both ways. He wants it to be that there is a theoretical form and a practical form, and those come together in the service of virtue. Now, what he does is really interesting, and no one knows where this comes from, but he associates the soul, the various elements of the soul, as the grounds of both the virtues, but also the vices. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that we get lots of typologies of virtues in ancient philosophical texts. We don't get a lot of typologies of vices. Aristotle will talk about them a bit, but what Apuleius gives us is a kind of breakdown of the specific vices associated with the different aspects of our soul. This is interesting. So, for instance, the chief vices that comes with reason is unteachability, right? If one of our fundamental aspects of our reason is phronesis, that means we learn stuff. If you're unable to learn or unwilling to learn, obviously that's going to be the vice that's going to most affect the soul. The soul needs to learn or remember, I guess, in the case of Platonism, but if it's incapable of that, then that's a pretty bad vice. And this takes two forms. The first is inexperience, right? Again, phronesis requires experience, so you need to get some experience. And the other is fatutitas, right? From fatus, Latin, stupidity, right? Foolishness. I love the fact that the word infatuation literally means to become stupid over someone, right? Infatuation is from fatus in Latin, stupid. So being inexperienced and being foolish, right? Again, look at those as sort of two poles of unteachability. If you're inexperienced, you're not going to learn any things, but also if you're foolish, you're going to get yourself killed. And therefore, right, you need to be able to balance out those. This is the opposite of Sophia and phronesis. Thumos, right, the part of us that is the thumatic part of us, the spirited part of us, the part of me that makes me write mean things about Brill on Instagram. So that part of me, right, my thumatic part, that is associated with audacity, audacitas, right, audacity. So again, if you think about you want to get out there and go do something, well, if you get out there and go do something without a lot of planning, you're just going to be audacious. So, right? So not the best thing. Fortune does favor the bold, but fortune punishes the audacious. And of course, the complementary versus the complementary vices here are irascibility, right? Irritability and placidity, right? If you're I don't know, if you're so angry that you just want to go do something and you just lash out and punch a wall, clearly that is the thumos not being used properly. But also, right, if your thumos is turned all the way down, you become completely placid. Not going to work either. And of passions, we can imagine the vices here. Sensuality. The Platonists are never going to have anything good to say about sensuality, right? They're never going to be, horniness, no dice, no bueno, right? You're not going to be able to get to do that. So being overly turned on, sensualness is not good. Avarice is going to be one dimension of this, and prodigality is going to be the other side of it, right? So wastefulness. So at any rate, an interesting description of the soul in terms of its vices, which is something we've not seen at this point, which is interesting. I mean, it's just an interesting thing to be pointed out. And also, Apuleius points out a fact that I think is not. I don't know that it gets made again until Kant, actually, is that you can have all kinds of virtues and still be evil. So imagine, someone like Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter is intelligent and brave, but he's also a psychopathic cannibal, right? So it's not enough to be intelligent and brave, but those have to be guided in certain kinds of ways. And how are they guided? They're guided by Sophia. So you can have phronesis. You can be brave and kidnap and cut up the census worker and eat his liver with a nice Chianti, but that needs to be guided by Sophia, and then therefore you wouldn't do that. So again, what he points out here is that these two need to be working in unison, because you can, again, as Kant pointed out, you can have a perfectly evil person who has all the, they can be moderate and courageous and just in some sense, but you don't need to be Hannibal Lecter. Now, to achieve the virtues, of course, right, to achieve the virtues, we undergo the process that we've already seen in Platonism, right? The process of ascesis, didascalia, and the phusis, right? You train your body, you train your phusis, you go through ascesis, you learn discipline, and then you get wisdom through the process of didascalia, of being educated properly and how to be a good person. We've seen that already, going back as far as Philo and stuff. Also, I should just point out briefly, to return to this idea, that this is an interesting imposition in some ways of the idea of the median that we see primarily in Aristotle, though many Platonists would say it's of common academic inheritance. We see it here on the very distinct tripartite division of the soul, which is not to be found in Aristotle and certainly not to be found in the Stoics. But here we have an interesting kind of imposition of the rule of the golden mean directly onto the tripartite soul of Plato, something that, to my knowledge, we haven't seen yet. Of the virtues, right, there are the perfect virtues and the imperfect virtues. The perfect virtues are those that allow us to attain to be godlike, and of course, those virtues are the classic virtues: the virtues of courage, moderation, prudence, and justice. Of the other imperfect virtues, right, we can those also assist us, but we attain to those are ultimately subspecies of the perfect virtues. And what's interesting is that we have in Apuleius the idea of the perfect sage. Now, the perfect sage is an idea that comes from Stoicism. This is not really a Socratic idea or a Platonic idea. It's a Stoic idea. And one of the things that the perfect sage achieves is the very Aristotelian virtue of megalosokia, which is just a great word to say in Greek, megalosokia. I think this gets translated into English as something like magnanimousness, which is somehow even more difficult to say than megalosokia. Great soulness, literally, is what it means in Greek. But the Stoic sage was said to achieve a version of megalosokia, and in achieving this, they become almost godlike. And this makes some sense, right? Because if you are a daimon, you are downstream of a divine being anyway. You are a divine being. Daimones are divine beings. And recall that the daimones, because they are eternal, they kind of already have seen past, present, and future all at once. right? So they've seen, this is why prophecy is possible. The daemones can communicate to us what's coming into the future because they can kind of already see it. They're like fourth dimensional or something. I don't know. That's not a great, I don't like imposing those kinds of ideas on them. But because they are eternal, they have a perspective on time that we don't have. Now, you are a daemon. You are a daemon, and because you are a daemon, if you become virtuous enough, you can achieve, you can unlock, right? You can unlock the secret, and you can achieve that kind of daemonic vision. And what he has is the idea that the people who are able to become fully in lock with their daemon can gain supernatural powers, one of which is the ability to see the remote past and to see the remote future. So again, this is his connection to sort of the magic stuff, right? Is that the daimon, because it is a being not bound by space and time, in some sense, has kind of powers that we are not actively using, because again, we think of ourselves as a meat bag and not as a daimon, or to quote Marcus Aurelius, you are a soul carrying around a corpse. And so, if you allow me to crib my Stoicism and Platonism, if you come to realize that you are just a soul, a daimon carrying around a corpse, and you focus really on developing your daimonic abilities through Sophia and Phronesis, you can gain access to some of those daimonic powers, one of which, according to Apuleius, is divination, seeing the future. So what we have, interestingly enough, in Apuleius is, again, a Stoic classification, not Chrysippin, later Stoic, and that is of the villain, right? The person that is wholly bad. We have the prokopton. The prokopton is the progressor, I guess you could translate it into English, the person on the path. That should be all of us. And if you really complete the path, you become a sage. You become a sage. And the sage, again, is the ability to, you get the supernatural powers, cities or something like that. And this idea, by the way, goes down into Christianity as well, where saints, we have the concept of the saint, and the saints will often get supernatural powers, levitation, healing people. The idea is that they become so godlike, or attuned to God, that they get supernatural powers. That concept of the saintly person ends up in Islam, it ends up in Judaism, but it has its origins, I think, largely in the Stoic concept of the sage, which again here we see in Apuleius. So as we wrap Apuleius today, again, I haven't said anything that should surprise anybody. Maybe a couple of interesting things we get from Apuleius, but nothing terribly mind-blowing. But what we can say, right, is to what degree do Alcinous and Apuleius represent a school? And I think that Dylan's answer is they don't. That Apuleius probably learned, he was a bit of a magpie. He probably learned at lots of different masters. He learned all over the place. We have him traveling around all kinds of places. So he probably picked up his Platonism in Athens and in North Africa, and who knows what else. Alcinous seems to have maybe picked up some of his stuff in Asia Minor. So probably what we're not seeing is a school of guys. Probably what we're seeing is this is just a Platonism that's in the air. So the school of Gaius probably is a demolished concept if we are to follow Dylan, and I think that we are right to follow him in the period. So this is probably just the emergent orthodoxy of the period. But this brings us to an end, an important end in this series. And what's the end that we've come to? The end is, this is the last Platonist. This is the last Platonist. We're not going to talk anymore about any other Platonists. This is the last one. We've talked about everybody from, the late, from the old academy to Antiochus of Ascalon and to Eudorus and all of these people. We've talked about all of these different Platonists. This is our last Platonist. But what was Plato? Was Plato a Platonist? No, he was a Pythagorean. And so we can out Plato the Platonists. And how do we out Plato the Platonists? We got to talk about the Pythagoreans, folks. We got to talk about the Pythagoreans. We got to talk about Moderatus. We got to talk about Numenius. We got to talk about all of the Pythagoreans skulking around at the very edges of the Platonic underworld. And it is to those characters that we turn to now. We're going to turn to now for the next, right? The next two sessions, we will turn to perhaps what they would claim are the authentic inheritors of the teachings of Plato, the authentic inheritors not being Platonists, but being Pythagoreans. And so it is to the Pythagoreans that we turn to next time.